Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mop coming at you with another APGov video. Once again, we're continuing to take a look at topic 1.7, focusing on the relationship between the states. And, when we talk about that relationship, once again, it's about federalism. It's that idea of, how does the national government, which has sovereign responsibilities, and the state governments, which have some sovereign responsibilities, how does that relationship play out? And we do talk about it as a relationship due to the fact that it evolves over time like a normal relationship. Now, later on in another video, we'll take a look at the concept of dual federalism and the idea of how to define that relationship between the national and state powers in the first half of American history. But this time, we're going to start off taking a look at what is really defining the relationship today in terms of federalism. And that is what we call cooperative federalism. Cooperative federalism is the idea that even though the national and the state governments have their own technical areas of power and authority, that even though that exists, they do, though, work together. They come together, in other words, acting cooperatively to solve problems. It's not like the feds kind of say, well, if it's a state issue, then that's the state's problem. Or if it's a national issue, the state doesn't say, well, that's the federal government's problem, it's not ours. It's the idea being is that, many problems, both the federal and the state governments will work together to solve that problem. And it's a relatively modern way of looking at that relationship. And we tend to look at it, starting during the 1930s, during the New Deal era of Franklin Roosevelt. Basically, what this kind of looks like is more federal involvement in what had traditionally been purely state and local issues. Back in the day, back in 1900 when Galveston, Texas was hit with a massive hurricane, there was no federal authority dealing with natural disasters like that. So the federal government pretty much told the state of Texas, well, that's a state issue. You're on your own. Good luck. Today, though, that would not be the case, and we're going to get into how that might look today. But to give you a sense of, how intertwined this relationship is between the federal and the state governments under cooperative federalism, we see a very famous, well-known, and let's be honest, tasty example that is brought to us by political scientist Morton Grodzins. Grodzin uses cake models to describe the different types of federalism that we've seen in American history. One is what we call a layer cake federalist model. We'll talk about that at a later time. What I want to take a look at is what cooperative federalism looks like today. It's like a marble cake. And as you take a look at this graphic right here, you can see that in a typical marble cake, you can see that the chocolate and the vanilla parts are distinct. In other words, you can see them. They're not globbed together as just one solid light brown cake, so to speak. So you can see the state and the federal components there. But because of the marbling, they are so intertwined that it's very difficult to separate, the relationship between the federal and the state governments in that sense. So that's really kind of, how we're looking at that. So when we talk about, cooperative federalism in action, in terms of, that idea of tying the state and the federal governments together. What is that thing that ties it together? Well, it's money. When we talk about cooperative federalism, a lot of it is tied to the concept of what we call categorical grants or categorical grants in aid. This is how the federal government is able, in reality, to intervene in things that had traditionally been the purview purely of the state governments. For example, think of public education. When we think of public education, we think of the 10th Amendment, because the 10th Amendment says that anything that's not explicitly given to the federal government as a power, nor denied to the states as a power, is therefore reserved for the states or the people respectively. So we're looking at, because of the 10th Amendment, public education is viewed as a state power. Okay, fine. That being said, though, that doesn't mean that the federal government over time has not had an interest in what is happening in public education in America. For example, we might have folks at the federal level that are concerned that some residents, some children in some states are getting a better quality of education than students in other states. Some might look at the history of public education, if you're going way back in time. The idea being is that, some students were getting an integrated public education regarding race, and other students were getting a segregated public education regarding race. And that was a concern of the federal government. So what we see here is that, there are concerns that the federal government may have, but these are traditionally viewed as state issues because this is dealing with state powers. So if you're looking at, for example, the concern of academic performance of students in school, the federal government has, a concerted interest in trying to make sure that, all students are successful in the classroom. Now, how can the federal government, have an influence to promote that compelling interest? Well, that's where the money comes in. When we talk about state governments have, challenges that the federal government doesn't quite have. When we talk about state governments, most state constitutions have some type of provision in them that dictates that they have to have balanced budgets every year. So in other words, they can only spend as much as they bring in taxes. That's it. And if you want to spend more money, you got to tax more, or cut something else to make up for increased spending in some part of the budget. But bottom line, states are almost always struggling for money because when we talk about Americans, we want as many services as we can get for as little money as possible. That's just how it is. So you've got states that are always in this very, very perilous financial state, or situation, I should say. Federal government, not quite the same thing. The federal government can print its own currency, but the states can't. The federal government can borrow money like the states can't. And so the federal government can run up a massive debt. And we know they can do it better than anybody else in the world, to the tune now of in excess of $30 trillion. Like I said, states can't do that. So what can then happen? Because the federal government's vast financial resources and powers, they then do have, in reality, the ability to provide money to the states. They can do that. And they know that since the states are very vulnerable financially, that the states are going to be very willing, and generally speaking, to accept that money from the federal government. Now note, the federal government does not generally give money to the states just to be nice, just to be charitable. And that's where this idea of a categorical grant comes in. A grant is simply the awarding of money from the federal government to the states. But most of these grants, the vast majority of these grants, generally are awards of money, if you want to think of it that way, that come with strings attached. So, for example, we're talking about the federal government having a vested interest in trying to have high-performing public schools. Well, the federal government might believe that the way to make this happen is to have mandatory, testing being done on students in core subject areas every single year, standardized testing. Now, states may not agree, but the federal government may say, hey, we will give you money, but you've got to do this thing that we want. We might give you money for your schools, but part of what that is doing this standardized testing, for example. So there's strings that are attached. It's not money for nothing, typically. So if you're a state, yes, you want the money, but there is some degree of grumbling because it's the federal government kind of intervening and saying, here's what you should be doing, as opposed to states feeling that they have the authority to decide what is best for themselves. So for example, the federal government might say that the most important thing for schools is to, test students for academic performance. But if a state like, say, Ohio were to receive money from the federal government for schools, Ohio might actually believe that, well, we might actually have more of a concern about the number of students that are receiving free and reduced lunches. So the idea being is that, hey, we would need money to help provide breakfast and lunch for lower income students. But if you're taking the money from the federal government is saying in this example that no, this money is not for breakfast and lunch. This is money for testing. This is money for, seeing if students are achieving academically. So you can kind of see where there's a little bit of tension in terms of that. The states need the money. And they don't like being told what to do with the money, but they need the money so much they generally do accept the terms that come with federal money. Now, when we talk about which of the major political parties tends to support something like this, it is generally the Democrats. Democrats tend to believe more in a stronger federal government vis-a-vis the states. So that's kind of more of that idea that there's a federal standard. And the idea being is that if you use federal authority, it helps to provide equality amongst citizens, that you are not the victim of bad government in a specific state simply because you live in a given state. Democrats tend to have more of a sense of you're an American rather than you are an Ohioan per se, generally speaking. All right. Now, in many cases, the federal government will also include strings that force the states to have some skin in the game financially. So you might have a situation where the state of Ohio is told by the federal government, "Hey, we're going to give you $1 billion for public education, but you got to pony up, $10 million to make that happen. You got to pony that up in some respects. It might be 100% matching, it might be 10% matching, or something along those lines. So that's also not uncommon. So this idea of using the money that the federal government has at its disposal to actively influence policy done at the state level, that is what we call fiscal federalism. Anytime that you use the term fiscal, that's talking about money. That's talking about taxing and spending. So it's talking about how money is to be spent at the state level with federal money coming in. Now, something that is also generally tied to these categorical grants, one of these strings, are what we call cross-cutting requirements. The idea being is that it is very typical for the federal government to say, hey, if you are going to accept this money for public education, if you will, then you also have to make sure that the money that is being spent is in compliance, for example, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that, prevents discrimination based on race. Or it has to comply, for example, perhaps with Title IX, which talks about protection from discrimination with regards to sex and gender. So that is also not uncommon. And once again, Democrats, liberals tend to be more of the mindset of placing that more of a priority to make sure that federal money is not going to be, spent in a discriminatory manner. And, think about, for example, back in the 1950s, the federal government gave Alabama money for public education. Well, that was a segregated school system back then. You can see how that would be applied in a discriminatory way. Now, something else that we do tend to see with regards to categorical grants are what we call crossover sanctions. A crossover sanction is a pretty creative thing. It's the idea of we will give states money for a specific thing if they do some other type of policy that may or may not be related. So in other words, we'll give you money for this as long as you do something else over here that we want. One very famous example of this is talking about state legal drinking ages. Traditionally going back 40, 50 years, states had various rules in terms of what the legal drinking age, 18, 19, 21, beer and wine for this age, liquor for this age, yada, yada, yada. Well, through the work of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MAD, a very influential interest group in the 1980s, they were able to lobby Congress to tell the states here. The federal government is going to tell the states, hey, you guys have a long history of receiving money from the federal government to help cover state highway funds. We are willing to continue to do that as the federal government if you make the agreement to raise the drinking age to 21. And so what the federal government has done is basically, used highway funds as muscle to basically crowbar 21 as the de facto national drinking age. Even though there is no technical national drinking age in the United States. It isn't. It's a state power. But if you look at all 50 individual states, it's all 21. Why? Because the federal government has demanded it as a way to receive federal highway funds. So understand it can get very creative like that. Okay, we'll leave it there for right now regarding categorical grants. When we come back next time, we're going to talk about block grants and mandates. We'll see you then.